They say genius belongs only on the stage, under the bright lights of lecture halls. But that night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, inside the silent library of Princeton, under the dim glow of a single oil lamp, a young janitor girl wrote words on the blackboard that made an entire council of professors fall silent. Rain stretched across Princeton that night like a silver thread, stitching every path with cold. The stone pavements were slick and shining, the lamps along the walkways bending their light into trembling golden pools. The air carried the smell of wet maple leaves, the sharpness of storm-soaked earth, and the quiet murmur of a campus that had given itself over to sleep. At the center of it all stood Firestone Library, tall and heavy like an ancient chest, guarding the written voices of centuries. Anna, 21 years old, pulled the frayed scarf tighter around her neck. The scarf was not hers, but borrowed, and though its wool was worn thin, it still held a little warmth. Her raincoat had been torn by a gust of wind the week before. Her mother had shaken her head and said, "Don't spend on that, Anna. Your brother needs the money for school." And so, she came as she was, scarf against her shoulders, the cold sneaking through. In her hands she carried the familiar broom, the quiet companion of her night work. Tonight, her assignment was simple. Clean basement A and the east corridor. The steps of her wet shoes echoed in the vestibule, then faded into the muffled carpeted halls. Inside, the air was thick with the perfume of paper, old leather, and polished oak. It was the smell of time itself, patient and unhurried. The silence was deep, so deep she could hear the rain tapping gently against the tall windows, steady as a heartbeat. She began her work. The broom slid over the carpet. The water bucket sloshed. A rag was wrung dry, then pressed against a stair rail. The sounds joined into a rhythm she knew well, a rhythm that belonged only to the unseen keepers of the place. She worked slowly, carefully, polishing wood as though it were her own home. When she reached the east corridor, she noticed something unusual, a door slightly ajar. A ribbon of light slipped out onto the floor. She hesitated, then placed her hand on the brass handle, cold as ice, and pushed. The door opened into a seminar room. A blackboard stretched across the wall, filled edge to edge with white chalk. Symbols marched across it like armies frozen mid-battle. Chalk dust clung to the frame like frost. In the corner, in clear letters, someone had written, "Princeton Conjecture, Draft Notes." Anna's breath caught. She had heard whispers of this before, the 20-year curse. Students spoke of it as if it were a ghost, a problem left unsolved for 2 decades, too heavy even for the brightest minds. To her, it was legend. And yet here it was, right in front of her, written in plain chalk, in a room left open on a rainy night. She stepped closer. The lamp cast her shadow small and uncertain on the great board. For others, the symbols were steel bars. For Anna, they were crooked paths she had walked before, alone, in secret. She had read at night, by dim light in a rented room, on second-hand books bought from flea markets, their covers torn and their margins full of notes. She had taken pictures of library journals on her cracked old phone. She had whispered new words to herself, words that belonged to mathematicians but felt like music she already half knew. And now, standing before the blackboard, she saw something strange. A step, written boldly, that looked awkward. Someone had forced a conclusion into place, like hammering a piece of wood into the hull of a boat. The boat might float, but it would always lean, always tremble. Her fingers brushed against a stub of chalk. She froze. "No," she told herself. "This is not yours. You are just a janitor, not a student, not a scholar." But then memory rose like a tide. Her father, gone in a construction accident when she was only 14. It had rained that day too, At the funeral, her mother had held her hand and whispered, "Learn, Anna. Say what is right. Do what is good." The words had stayed with her, small but burning, a hidden lamp inside her chest. At that moment, the library lights clicked off. The building's system had gone to sleep, leaving the room in darkness. Only one small oil lamp, old and nearly forgotten, glowed in the corner. It filled the room with soft gold, enough to make the chalk shine. Anna lifted the chalk. The sound of its first touch was sharp, fragile, like the cry of a bird in silence. She wrote one slow line, then another. Each word, each sign was like a careful step across thin ice. She did not try to solve the whole thing. She only corrected the place where the reasoning seemed forced. She thought to herself, instead of pressing the storm harder, why not guide it gently? In her mind appeared an image, waves crashing against a stone wall. Of course they shattered. But if the shoreline sloped into sand, the waves would quiet down, their rhythm preserved, their violence eased. Mathematics, she realized, could be kind too. The door opened suddenly. "What are you doing here?" a deep voice asked. Anna turned, startled. Mr. Harris, the night guard, stood there, his coat dripping, his silver hair clinging wet to his forehead. His face was stern, ready to scold. But his eyes moved to the board. He stopped. He was no mathematician, but he could see order where it lived. He could tell this was not nonsense. This was a conversation between a young woman and symbols too proud for most to tame. Anna lowered her eyes. "It was raining. My coat is torn. I thought I'd wait inside." Harris walked in, placing the lamp nearer the board. The glow grew stronger over the chalk lines. "You wrote this?" he asked quietly. "I only tried," she whispered. "If it's wrong, I will erase it." He studied her face, then the board. His voice softened. "Don't erase. Not yet. Let me call someone." The air in the room grew heavy, as if holding its breath. Outside, the rain continued its quiet tapping. Inside, Anna's heart beat louder, steady as a drum. She sat down, folding her hands tight. Memories rose. Nights delivering food, mornings cleaning classrooms before dawn, afternoons sneaking into public libraries to read. Hard words she had learned slowly. Stability, convergence, resonance. Words that to her meant something simple. The effort to keep things from breaking, the hope that even under stress, a structure might endure. Footsteps came down the hall. A man entered, not hurried but careful. He was in his 50s, coat dark, glasses sliding low on his nose. Professor Coleman. He glanced at Harris, then at the board. His eyes narrowed. "Who wrote this part?" he asked. Anna rose. "I only tried to adjust the step." Coleman approached. He read slowly, lips moving. He removed his glasses, wiped them, and read again. He turned toward her. "Where did you study this?" She shook her head. "I didn't. I work nights. I clean." The words fell into the silence like stones into water. Harris shifted uneasily, but Coleman did not scold. After a pause, he smiled. Tired, yes, but real. "Keep writing," he said softly. "Tonight, I am only a reader." The oil lamp flickered, steady but small. Anna picked up the chalk again, less afraid now. She drew another line and explained, halting but clear. "If you cushion the edge, the waves don't break so hard. The energy remains, but no one gets hurt. It's like covering the corner of a table so a child won't bruise." Coleman let out a low chuckle, the chuckle of a man who had searched years for the right metaphor. "Yes, a good guard at the edge. And if the strength is kept, the structure remains whole." He turned to Harris. "Do you see? We sit here by an oil lamp and someone has remembered to light it." The rain outside softened. Anna placed the chalk down. Her hands were white with dust, but her heart no longer trembled. In that quiet room, 3 lives crossed: a janitor girl, a guard, and a professor. Between them, a lamp burned, a blackboard breathed, and the night took a different shape. For the first time in many years, Anna felt her father's words like warmth against her chest. She felt her mother's strength beside her, and she realized she was not alone anymore. The night was not over, but sometimes one small lamp is enough to make dawn believable. The storm did not end, but it grew gentler. The hard drumming of rain on the campus paths softened into a steady murmur, like fingers brushing lightly across a drum. Gutters overflowed, carrying streams of water away into the dark. Firestone Library stood watch as it had for 100 years, its windows glowing faintly as though they were eyes that had seen storms come and go, and knew this one too would pass. Inside, the seminar room was hushed. The oil lamp threw its golden light unevenly across the great blackboard. On the left were the old chalk marks, bold and rigid. On the right were Anna's new lines, smaller, more careful, but alive with a strange clarity. Together they seemed like 2 halves of a conversation, one voice stern and proud, the other gentle but insistent. Anna sat with her hands folded in her lap, chalk dust still clinging to her fingers. She felt as though she had intruded upon something forbidden. The silence in the room pressed against her ears, not empty, but heavy, as if the board itself was holding its breath. Professor Coleman stood before the chalk marks, glasses low on his nose, his hand hovering just short of the surface as if he might touch the words but dared not smudge them. Behind him, Harris the guard leaned on the doorframe, arms folded, his eyes flicking between the girl and the professor. Finally, Coleman spoke, his voice deep and deliberate. "Anna, do you know what you have written tonight?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir. I only saw a step that felt forced. It didn't sit right. It wasn't stable." Coleman nodded slowly. He tapped the board with one finger very softly, like testing the sound of a drum. "For 20 years, this problem has sat on our shoulders. It is like a stubborn lock that refuses every key. We call it the Princeton conjecture, but it might as well be called the Princeton silence. Because that is what it has given us. 2 decades of silence." He turned to look at her. "Do you know what happens at the edge of a system, Anna? At the boundary? The center may be calm, but the edges are where things unravel. Take a violin string. If you pluck it gently in the middle, the sound is sweet. But strike it near the end, and it screams. That is what functions do, too. Near the boundary, they scream." Anna thought of her brother's guitar back home. He used to strum for her after long days of work. She remembered how the strings sang differently depending on where his fingers touched. She understood. She nodded. Coleman gestured to her chalk lines. "You have quieted the scream. You gave the edge a cushion. Instead of letting the waves crash against the wall, you guided them into sand. It is such a simple thought, and yet we missed it. We fought the storm instead of listening to it." Anna spoke softly, almost afraid of her own words. "Sometimes, storms are not meant to be fought. They are meant to be guided." The professor's mouth curved into a smile, slow and genuine, the kind of smile that had not visited his face in years. Harris saw it and shook his head in quiet wonder, as though he were watching something rare and fragile unfold. The clock on the wall ticked toward 2:30. Outside, the rain still fell, steady and tired. Anna rose to fetch her cleaning cart, ashamed of lingering too long. "I should finish my work," she said. Leave it, Harris muttered gently. The floor won't mind one night without polish. Anna hesitated. She had never been given such permission before. To her, work was always something that demanded completion, no matter how tired or wet she was. But there was something in the guard's voice that felt less like permission and more like recognition. Recognition that this night was not ordinary. Coleman adjusted his glasses. Anna, may I ask, how did you come to these ideas? Weighted cushions, softened boundaries? These are not janitor's tools. She lowered her eyes, staring at the pale dust on her hands. After my father died, I found an old book at the bottom of his toolbox. He was a construction worker. It was just a college algebra book. But I opened it, and the numbers felt like music I had been waiting to hear. Later, I borrowed library books. I copied notes that professors left behind. I didn't always understand, but I tried. Every night, I tried. Her voice softened even more. The pages didn't judge me. They let me stay. Coleman inhaled deeply, as if her words carried more weight than he could hold. He turned back to the board and studied her lines again, lips moving silently as though tasting them. After a long pause, he said, You must understand. If this holds, Anna, then you have done in an hour what a generation could not. But the world will not accept it easily. Tomorrow, there will be questions. And the first question will be, how could a janitor do this? Anna shook her head quickly, panic flashing. No, please. Erase it. Pretend I was never here. Coleman turned sharply. Erase it. Child, do you not see? This board is no longer silent. The words rang in the room like a bell. Harris straightened where he stood, as though some old soldier's reflex had stirred in him. Anna's throat tightened. For years, she had lived in silence. The silence of the poor, the silence of immigrants who kept their heads low, the silence of women who scrubbed floors when others studied. And now here, on this blackboard in Princeton, her silence had been broken by chalk. Coleman saw her trembling and softened his tone. Listen to me. Mathematics is not about the names on doors. It is about truth revealed. And truth belongs to whoever dares to hold it, even for a moment. Tonight, you held it. Anna blinked quickly, embarrassed by the wetness in her eyes. Harris stepped forward with 2 steaming cups of tea he had warmed in the guard's room. Here, he said gruffly, placing one before her. For the storm. The 3 of them sat, professor, guard, janitor, sipping quietly while the lamp flickered. Outside, the storm eased, raindrops falling softer and slower, like a tired hand finally setting down its work. After a time, Coleman leaned back, his eyes still on the board. Tomorrow, I will call a colleague. Quietly. We will check these steps one by one. If they hold, then you must be the one to present them. Not I. Not anyone else. Anna almost laughed in disbelief. Me? Before the council? Before all those professors? Why not? Coleman said simply. Truth has no uniform. It shines wherever it is written. Harris nodded. He's right, girl. Lamps don't choose the hands that carry them. They just burn. The oil flame danced as if in agreement. Anna looked once more at the blackboard. The chalk lines glowed faintly in the golden light, no longer hers alone, but part of the night itself. The blackboard, once mute, now seemed alive, no longer silent, but waiting, remembering. In that silence, Anna felt something she had not felt in years. Promise. Promise that her father's words, say what is right, do what is good, had found their place. The library clock struck 3. Harris collected the empty cups. Coleman gathered his coat. Anna wheeled her cart toward the door, then paused. She turned back for one last glance. The blackboard stood tall, the lamp still glowing. The silence was different now. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a seed beneath the soil, waiting to rise. And Anna knew this was only the beginning. The clock had already struck 3, yet none of them felt the pull of sleep. The room carried a different kind of wakefulness now, the kind born not from coffee or duty, but from the trembling nearness of discovery. The oil lamp glowed at the corner of the blackboard, steady and warm, its tiny flame defying the darkness of the storm outside. Anna sat quietly, her broom and pail forgotten by the door. Her hands, still dusted with chalk, rested in her lap. She felt like a trespasser, a visitor in a place she was never meant to enter. And yet the lamp's light fell on her as naturally as it did on the professor, as if making no distinction. Professor Coleman walked the length of the blackboard once more. His steps were slow, as if he were pacing inside a cathedral. His eyes ran over the symbols, left and right, comparing the rigid scaffolding of the old argument with the softer lines Anna had drawn. Every now and then he murmured something under his breath, half to himself, half to the board. Harris, leaning on the doorway, took a sip from the last of his tea and watched the two of them. He was no scholar, no mathematician, but he recognized the weight of moments. He had guarded these halls for years, witnessed countless nights of students burning themselves down to embers over exams and papers. But this was different. This night smelled of history. Coleman finally turned from the board. "Anna," he said softly, "do you know why we use lamps, even now? Why an old oil lamp remains in this room when electricity runs everywhere?" Anna shook her head. "Because electricity is convenient. Lamps, though—" He gestured toward the flame. "Lamps are patient. They remind us that knowledge is not always a flash. Sometimes it is a slow burn, steady and stubborn against the night. Tonight, you are that lamp." Anna looked down, embarrassed. She was no lamp, only a girl in a torn scarf with calloused hands. Yet the warmth in Coleman's voice planted something in her heart, small and trembling, like the wick of the flame. The rain outside softened further, tapping gently against the tall windows. The storm that had been fierce hours before now whispered like a tired friend. The silence inside grew deeper, but it was no longer oppressive. It was a silence filled with expectancy, like soil that had just received rain, waiting for seeds to stir. Coleman pulled a chair beside her. His face looked worn, lined with years of teaching and disappointment. "Do you know what happens tomorrow?" he asked. Anna shook her head. "Tomorrow whispers will spread. They will say a janitor scribbled nonsense on the board. They will laugh. They will question my judgment. And yet, when I show them what you have written, some will pause. Some will wonder. And a few will recognize what I already suspect, that the silence of 20 years has been broken." Anna's heart tightened. "But I can't stand before professors. They will see me and laugh harder." Coleman's gaze softened. "Do you know what courage is, Anna? It is not the absence of fear. It is standing before the laughter and choosing to speak anyway. Tonight, you showed courage in chalk. Tomorrow, you must show it in voice." Anna bit her lip. She thought of her father again, the day of his funeral. Her mother's whisper, "Say what is right. Do what is good." Those words had felt small against the weight of grief. Tonight they felt large enough to carry her trembling. Harris shifted against the doorway, his voice rough but kind. "Girl, you think you're alone? You're not. You got 2 old men here who saw it with their own eyes. If anyone laughs, let 'em laugh." A storm doesn't stop a lamp from burning." The words landed in her chest like a shield. They sat together in the warm circle of the lamp, none of them rushing the night. Outside, the storm thinned to drizzle. Somewhere far across the campus, a bell tower marked the slow crawl of time. Coleman leaned back, his eyes far away. "Do you know why I stayed in mathematics, Anna? Not for titles, not for praise, but for nights like this. Rare nights when the universe leans close, when truth slips through the cracks for a moment, and we are lucky enough to catch it. Most of us chase that moment for decades. You stumbled into it while waiting for rain to stop." Anna shook her head. "I only saw something uneven." "And that," Coleman said, "is how most great discoveries begin. Not with trumpets, not with applause, just with someone noticing that a single stone is out of place in the wall and daring to move it." Harris chuckled, folding his arms. "And usually it's not the stone everyone else is staring at either." The lamp flickered, casting the room in waves of light and shadow. Anna gazed at it, remembering the oil lamps of her childhood. Back in her village, power often went out. Her mother would light a lamp, place a metal basin behind her books so the flame would reflect brighter. Anna had done her schoolwork in that glow, the smell of kerosene lingering in the air. She thought of that basin now, and of how her mother had quietly guarded her eyes from the dark. Tears welled unexpectedly. She turned her face away, but Coleman noticed. He said nothing, only let the silence hold her. Harris cleared his throat gruffly and busied himself adjusting the wick of the lamp, though it burned perfectly well already. After a long pause, Coleman spoke again. "Anna, when you go before the council, they will demand precision. You must show them your reasoning step by step. They will interrupt, they will press. But remember this, you do not go alone. Behind you will stand every night you studied by lamplight, every page you copied, every word you whispered to yourself. You will not speak only for yourself, but for them too." Anna whispered, "For them?" "Yes," Coleman said firmly. "For the fathers who never saw their dreams finish. For the mothers who worked until their hands broke. For every child who reads by borrowed light. You will speak for them." The flame trembled in the lamp's glass, as if stirred by his words. Anna drew a breath, deep and steady. For the first time that night, she lifted her chin. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something steadier, like a thread of iron hidden in the fabric of cloth. They sat until nearly 4, the night crawling toward morning. When at last Harris insisted she head home to rest, Anna rose reluctantly. She placed the chalk back on the board's ledge, gently, like setting down a relic. She glanced one last time at the blackboard. It no longer looked like a wall. It looked like a door. Outside, the rain had faded to mist. The air smelled of wet stone and quiet promise. Anna pulled her scarf tighter, stepping into the damp night. Behind her, the oil lamp still glowed in the seminar room, small but fierce, a witness to the moment that silence cracked. As she walked across the empty campus, she thought of what Coleman had said. "You are that lamp." She did not yet believe it fully, but the thought warmed her against the chill. The world still slept. Dawn was hours away. Yet in Anna's heart, a light had already been lit. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the campus wrapped in a hushed silver mist. The lawns glistened with dew, and the cobblestones held puddles that mirrored the pale morning sky. Firestone Library stood still, as though it too had stayed awake through the long night, guarding a secret it could not yet tell. Inside, the blackboard remained as Anna had left it, the rigid scaffolding of the old attempt on one side and her gentler correction on the other. Chalk dust still clung to the ledge like frost. The oil lamp, its flame now extinguished, sat quiet but dignified, as if it knew its work had only just begun. Anna had gone home to rest at last. Coleman had promised to call on her when the time came, but for now he had insisted she disappear into sleep. The professor himself left shortly after, his mind alive with calculations and doubts, but also with a rare lightness. For years, he had carried the silence of that conjecture like a stone in his coat pocket. Last night, for the first time, it had shifted. That morning, the library belonged to Harris. The old guard walked his rounds with the same steady rhythm he had kept for decades. To many, he was invisible. The man who turned keys, who checked locks, who mumbled greetings no one answered. But Harris had seen more of Princeton than most professors ever did. He had watched generations of students pass through its doors, each convinced they were the first to suffer sleepless nights and impossible questions. He had seen triumphs, failures, heartbreaks, and though he had never lectured, he knew what real study looked like, the kind that left a person both weary and alive. That was what he had seen in Anna. As he passed the seminar room, Harris paused at the doorway. The board stood silent now, but he remembered the sound of chalk in the quiet hours, the trembling yet determined hand that had written, and the professor's face as it shifted from skepticism to awe. Harris had guarded many nights, but never one like that. He thought of Anna, small, tired, wearing her torn scarf. He thought of how quickly she had asked for her work to be erased, how ready she had been to vanish back into silence. He frowned. "Not this time," he muttered under his breath. "Not on my watch." Later that morning, when Coleman returned with a colleague from the mathematics department, Harris stayed nearby, listening. The men examined the blackboard with sharp eyes, erasing nothing, muttering to each other in low tones. Coleman's colleague frowned deeply, pacing. At last he said, "It shouldn't work. It's too simple. And yet—" He stopped, stared again, and shook his head as though trying to wake from a dream. Harris could not follow their words, but he caught the tone. Disbelief, then cautious respect. He smiled faintly to himself. So it wasn't just imagination. That evening after his shift, Harris walked home slower than usual. He lived in a small brick house on the edge of town, modest and worn. His wife had passed some years ago, and his children were grown, scattered. The house was quiet, too quiet most nights. But tonight, he sat at his kitchen table long after supper, thinking of Anna. He remembered when he himself was young, working nights while trying to learn mechanics from borrowed manuals. He had never been a great student. War had come, then work, then family. But he knew the longing in Anna's eyes, the hunger not just to live, but to understand. He had felt it once. Life had pressed it out of him. He would not let it be pressed out of her. The next evening, when Anna arrived for her shift, Harris was waiting by the library door. "You," he said, his voice rough but kind. "Come here a minute." Anna blinked, startled. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Harris said firmly. "But you're not hiding anymore. Not from this. I called Coleman this morning. He's bringing others. You're going to show them yourself." Her face went pale. "No, I can't. They'll laugh at me." "Let them laugh," Harris said. "A laugh is only noise. The truth is louder, and I'll be there. So will Coleman. You won't be standing alone." Anna's throat tightened. She wanted to refuse, to slip back into the safety of invisibility. But the old man's eyes held her still. They were tired eyes, lined by years of storms, but steady as stone. She realized then that Harris was not just a guard of doors and keys. He was a guard of people. And tonight, he was guarding her. The following night, Coleman returned with 2 more professors. Harris unlocked the seminar room and stood watch at the door. Anna hovered at the threshold, heart pounding. The professors eyed her with a mixture of confusion and impatience. One whispered, "Is this a joke?" Coleman silenced him with a look. "Go on," Harris said gently behind her. "Step inside." Anna stepped forward. Her hands trembled. The chalk felt heavier than iron in her grip. She faced the board. For a moment, the silence of the room threatened to crush her. Then she remembered the lamp. She pictured its flame, small, unsteady, but burning anyway. She remembered Coleman's words, "You are that lamp." And Harris's, "A storm doesn't stop a lamp from burning." Her breath steadied. She raised the chalk. In the doorway, Harris folded his arms, his lips pressing into a thin line of pride. He was not a man of equations, but he was a man who knew when someone was standing where they were meant to stand. And tonight, Anna was exactly where she belonged. The blackboard waited. The professors leaned forward. Harris kept his silent watch. The night had begun. The seminar room smelled faintly of chalk and rain-soaked stone. Outside, the evening drizzle tapped softly on the tall windows, a rhythm that seemed to steady Anna's shaking hands. She stood before the blackboard, chalk pressed between her fingers like a fragile sword. Behind her, Harris leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, his presence solid and unyielding. Professor Coleman stood to her side, ready but silent, his eyes fixed on her as though urging her forward without words. Seated at the long table were 3 professors from Princeton's mathematics department. Their faces were lined not only with age, but with years of disappointment. They had seen too many false promises, bright students claiming breakthroughs, only for their work to collapse under scrutiny. To them, this was another distraction. A janitor girl with chalk dust on her hands? At best, a curiosity. At worst, a waste of time. One of them, Professor Adler, cleared his throat. His voice was clipped, impatient. "Coleman, I don't know why you've called us here. Surely this could wait for the morning?" Coleman's reply was quiet but firm. "I called you here because I believe history does not always wait for morning." Adler raised an eyebrow, then turned his gaze toward Anna. "And this is the one?" Anna's throat tightened. She wanted to step back, to disappear into the shadows where she belonged. But Harris's voice echoed in her memory. "A storm doesn't stop a lamp from burning." She gripped the chalk tighter. "Yes," Coleman said. "She is the one." The room fell into a hush. Anna turned toward the board. The symbols from the previous night still lingered, faint but clear. Her heart thudded so loudly she feared they would hear it. She began, her voice small. "This problem, the one they call the Princeton conjecture, has been open for 20 years. The difficulty lies not in the center, but at the edges. At the boundary, the system becomes unstable. Like a string struck too near the end, it screams." Her words trembled, but the metaphor steadied her. She thought of her brother's guitar, the sound sharp at the bridge, sweet in the middle. She spoke more firmly. Many attempts tried to silence that scream by force, to press it into submission and die. But forcing only makes the noise louder. The boundary resists. She wrote slowly, her hand still shaking. "What if, instead of resisting, we guide? What if the edge is cushioned, like sand softening the crash of waves?" The professors leaned in, frowning. They did not yet believe, but they listened. Anna's voice gained strength as she drew lines, explaining step by step how a simple adjustment, gentle where others had been harsh, allowed the chaos at the edge to quiet itself. She used no technical jargon. She spoke in images, waves on a shore, strings of an instrument, a child's table corner covered with padding. By softening the boundary, she said, the storm does not vanish, but it calms. Its energy is preserved, but its violence is eased, and once the boundary is tamed, the rest follows. The room was silent, but not empty. It was the silence of thought. Adler frowned, his fingers steepled. That's an interesting metaphor, but metaphors do not make proofs. Anna lowered her chalk. No, sir, but every proof begins with a picture in the mind. This was mine. The rest is only patience. Coleman's lips curved into the faintest smile. He recognized courage in her words. Another professor, Dr. Lin, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He studied the board carefully, his brow furrowed. Then, slowly, he nodded. The approach is unconventional, but it avoids the collapse at the boundary. Coleman, do you see? This could work. Adler's eyes narrowed. A janitor girl, writing in chalk at midnight, solves what we could not. Do you understand what you're claiming? Anna turned toward him. Her hands trembled, but her voice steadied. I am not claiming anything, sir. The board is, the work is. I only listened to what it whispered. The room grew still again. Harris shifted at the door, his eyes bright with pride. The silence stretched long, broken only by the faint patter of rain. Finally, Coleman stepped forward. He placed a hand on the blackboard, as though it were an altar. Gentlemen, he said, you may doubt her, you may doubt me, but do not doubt what is before your eyes. For 20 years we have stood before this silence. Tonight, it has spoken. Adler leaned back in his chair, silent now, his expression unreadable. Dr. Lin continued to study the board, his lips moving soundlessly. The third professor, Dr. Rhodes, rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Anna stood frozen, waiting for laughter, for dismissal, for the cruel words that had so often followed her in life. None came. Only silence. It was Harris who finally broke it. His voice was low, rough from years of smoke and weather, but steady. You don't have to believe her yet, he said. But you cannot erase what she's written. You saw it yourselves. A lamp doesn't burn less just because you close your eyes. The professors looked at the old guard, surprised at his intrusion, but Harris held their gaze without flinching. He had spent a lifetime watching doors. Tonight he was guarding this one, the door Anna had opened. The clock ticked toward midnight. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. Coleman turned back to Anna. You've done enough for tonight. Go home, rest. Tomorrow we'll bring questions, but tonight you have lit the lamp. Anna placed the chalk gently on the ledge, her heart racing but lighter than before. She bowed her head slightly, then stepped away from the board. As she passed the doorway, Harris gave her a small nod. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of recognition. Recognition that she had stepped into her place, trembling but unbroken. Behind her, the professors murmured in low voices, their skepticism bending, their certainty shaken. The blackboard, silent for 20 years, now carried a voice it had never known. The hand of a janitor girl, steady under an oil lamp at 2 a.m. The seminar room was heavy with silence. The rain outside had thinned to a faint drizzle, the kind that lingers like breath upon the window. Inside, the blackboard loomed, one side filled with the failed attempts of years past, the other with Anna's hesitant yet luminous lines. The professors remained at the long oak table, their bodies angled forward, their eyes fixed on the board. Coleman stood nearby, his expression a mixture of watchfulness and quiet pride. Harris leaned against the door, arms folded, a silent sentinel. And Anna. Anna stood at the center of them all, chalk still trembling in her hand. She had spoken. She had dared to explain, and though doubt lingered on their faces, none had dismissed her. That in itself was a miracle. But the board was not finished. The lines she had written were only bridges, sketches of a path. If she stopped now, the professors could say it was luck, a coincidence, a trick of metaphor. To silence the laughter before it began, she would have to walk the path to its very end. Coleman saw the fear flicker across her face. He leaned closer and whispered so only she could hear. "You've brought us this far, Anna. Do not stop at the shore. Carry it across the sea." Her hand tightened around the chalk. Anna turned back to the board. She drew a deep breath. Then slowly she began to write again. Her voice returned, quiet at first, but clearer with each sentence. Once the boundary is cushioned, the system does not collapse. It remains calm enough to follow through. What was once unstable becomes steady. The pieces fall into place. She wrote line after line, her metaphors shaping the abstract into something they could all see. "Imagine," she said, "a choir singing in a cathedral. If one voice wails too sharply, the harmony shatters. But if the edges are softened, if that voice is guided, then the harmony holds." That is what happens here. The chorus of the system remains whole. Her chalk scratched across the board. Each mark carried not arrogance, but necessity. She was not showing off. She was showing through, as though the truth itself had asked her to be its hand. The professors leaned in closer. Dr. Lynn scribbled notes furiously, his eyes darting between her lines and his own. Dr. Rhodes whispered something under his breath, then fell silent again. Even Adler, who had scoffed before, now sat still, his chin resting on his hand, his gaze narrowing not in dismissal, but in concentration. Minutes passed. The lamp flickered. The drizzle outside turned to silence. At last, Anna lowered the chalk. Her hand ached, her arm weak from holding it so long. She stepped back, staring at what she had written. The board was no longer a battlefield of fragments. It was whole. The room remained silent. Coleman moved first. He stepped closer to the board, eyes sweeping line by line, his lips moving soundlessly. His hand trembled as he traced the flow from beginning to end. Then he turned back to the table. "It is complete," he said softly. The words fell like a stone into still water. The professors shifted, some in disbelief, some in awe. Dr. Lynn stood, moving closer. His eyes scanned the proof, his finger following Anna's lines. At one point he paused, frowned, then nodded slowly. He whispered, "Yes, yes, it holds." Dr. Rhodes rose next, silent, his face pale. He stared at the final conclusion, then looked at Anna with something between wonder and sorrow, as if realizing that 20 years of his own labor had just been undone by a girl who cleaned the floors at night. Only Adler remained seated. His arms crossed, his jaw tight, he stared not at the board, but at Anna herself. Finally he spoke. His voice was low, almost bitter. "Do you even understand what you've done? Or have you only stumbled into it by accident?" Anna lifted her eyes to him. For once, her voice did not tremble. "I understand enough to know it is true, and I understand enough to know that truth does not belong to me. It belongs to whoever dares to listen." Adler looked away. The room fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence of skepticism. It was the silence of recognition. Anna's shoulders sagged. She placed the chalk gently on the ledge, as though setting down a burden. Her eyes blurred with tears she could not hold back. All the nights of hidden study, the stolen hours with borrowed books, the whispered prayers of her mother, the memory of her father's voice, all of it flowed through her in that moment. She covered her face with her hands, and the tears fell freely. Coleman stepped forward. His voice was steady, but softer than she had ever heard it. "Anna," he said, "you have solved what we could not. You have broken the silence of 20 years. Her knees weakened, and she leaned against the table for support. She shook her head. "I only wanted to make sense of what felt wrong." "And that," Coleman said, "is what makes it right." Harris's voice came from the doorway, rough with pride. "She's more than a janitor now. She's a light, and you all saw it." The professors said nothing, but their silence spoke. It was no longer heavy with doubt. It was heavy with awe. Anna lifted her head at last. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes shone. She whispered, "Father, Mother, I did not let go." No one laughed. No one scoffed. Even Adler, who still sat stiffly, kept silent. The blackboard glowed in the lamp's light, filled not just with chalk, but with the weight of a moment that would outlive them all. For the first time since she was a child, Anna felt whole. Morning broke quietly over Princeton. The storm had left the air clear, and the first light of day stretched gently across the lawns, turning each drop of rain into a jewel. The campus seemed unchanged, its old towers and ivy-clad walls standing as they had for generations. Yet within those walls, something had shifted. In the seminar room, the blackboard still bore the marks of the night before. Anna's chalk lines glowed faintly in the early sunlight. They looked fragile, as though a single swipe of a cloth might erase them forever. And yet, in their fragility, they held a weight strong enough to bend the course of a university. By mid-morning, whispers began to stir. At first, it was just a murmur in the faculty lounge. A janitor girl, they said. A janitor girl had solved something. Impossible. Absurd. Yet the rumor carried the name of Coleman, and Coleman was not a man to waste words. In the corridors, students overheard fragments of conversation between professors. "Did you hear?" "Nonsense! But Coleman insists." "No, not possible." "We'll see tonight." By noon, the whispers had grown legs. They reached the dining halls, the lecture rooms, the library stacks. Some laughed outright. A janitor? Solving a problem professors had failed for decades? Others scoffed, shaking their heads. But a few lowered their voices, their curiosity sharper than their doubt. Anna knew nothing of this at first. She had slept late into the morning, exhausted from the long night. When she finally woke, the sunlight spilled into her small, rented room. For a brief, drowsy moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. But when she looked at her hands, the faint dust of chalk still clung to her skin. It was real. She pressed her palms together and whispered the words her mother had always told her. "Say what is right. Do what is good." Then she rose to face the day. When she arrived at the library that evening for her shift, the air felt different. Students glanced at her in the hallways, some with curiosity, others with smirks. A pair of boys whispered behind her back, stifling laughter. Anna lowered her eyes and hurried past, her broom handle clutched tighter than usual. Harris was waiting for her near the east corridor. "Don't mind them," he said, his voice low and steady. "Rumors are like wind. They make noise, but they can't move stone. You just keep standing." Anna tried to smile, but her heart was heavy. She had lived her life in silence, unnoticed, unseen. Now that eyes had turned toward her, she wished only to vanish again. But that night, she could not. When she entered the seminar room, she found not emptiness, but an audience. A handful of professors were already gathered, seated stiffly, their notebooks open. Coleman stood at the front, his arms folded, his face calm. He beckoned her in. "Anna," he said gently, "it is time." Her breath caught. She looked around the room, at the skeptical eyes, at the expectant faces. Every instinct told her to run. But then she saw Harris at the doorway, nodding once. And she remembered the oil lamp. She walked forward slowly, her shoes quiet on the carpet. The blackboard loomed again, its surface waiting. She picked up the chalk. Coleman turned to the others. "You have all heard the rumor. Tonight you may see for yourselves. The board does not lie." The professors exchanged uneasy glances. Some leaned back, arms crossed. Others leaned forward, curious despite themselves. Anna began. Her voice trembled at first, but she spoke anyway. She explained the heart of the problem, not with heavy terms, but with images they could not ignore. Strings screaming at the edges, waves crashing against stone, a child's table corner softened with padding. She showed how the chaos could be quieted, how the system could be guided instead of forced. As she spoke, the room grew quieter. Scribbling slowed. Doubts did not vanish, but the laughter stopped. Her metaphors reached them in ways numbers alone had not. When she finished, the silence was heavy. Then came the questions. Sharp, direct, demanding. "Show us how it holds here. Why does the stability extend beyond the edge? What about when the system is perturbed?" Anna's knees shook, but she answered as best she could. Not with arrogance, but with the honesty of someone who had lived with these questions alone, night after night. Her answers were simple, but they carried the ring of truth. At last, Dr. Lin closed his notebook. "I cannot dismiss this," he said quietly. "It deserves a full review." Adler remained cold. "It is too soon to call it a solution. We must be careful before attaching names." Coleman's voice was firm. "Names matter less than truth, and the truth has begun to speak." The professors filed out slowly, their faces thoughtful, some skeptical still, others shaken. The rumor would not end tonight. It would grow louder, but it would not vanish. Anna set the chalk down, her hand trembling. She turned to Harris. "They don't believe me." Harris shook his head. "Some don't. Some never will. But others heard you tonight, and that's enough. Truth doesn't need everyone at once. It only needs a beginning." Coleman stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The beginning has been made, Anna. Now it will spread, whether you wish it or not." Anna lowered her head. The thought frightened her. But deep within, beneath the fear, a small warmth glowed. The lamp was still burning. Outside, the mist of rain had lifted. The campus lay under a sky of scattered stars. Students walked across the lawns, still whispering, still doubting, still wondering. And so the rumor spread. The summons came 2 days later. Coleman delivered it himself, his expression grave but kind. He found Anna in the library, bent over her mop, and handed her a folded sheet of paper. The seal of the mathematics department was stamped across the top. "They want you," he said softly. Anna wiped her damp hands on her apron before touching the letter. She opened it slowly, her eyes moving over the words. The Council of Professors would convene at dusk in the great lecture hall. She was to present her argument in full, without interruption, without metaphor, and without retreat. Her breath caught. "I can't," she whispered. "I'll fail. They'll see who I am." Coleman placed a hand on her shoulder. "Anna, they already see. What matters now is that you let them hear." Harris appeared in the doorway, leaning on his keys. "Don't run, girl. Storm's coming, and it's yours to walk through. But remember, lamps shine brightest when storms are darkest." Anna folded the letter with trembling fingers. She nodded, though her heart pounded. The lecture hall that evening was unlike anything she had ever entered. Tall, arched windows lined the walls, their glass darkened by nightfall. The room smelled faintly of chalk and old wood, the air heavy with the weight of generations of debate. Rows of wooden seats curved upward like an amphitheater, filled now with professors, researchers, and even a scattering of graduate students who had slipped in to witness the spectacle. At the center stood the blackboard, scrubbed clean, waiting. Anna stepped inside with Coleman at her side and Harris just behind her. The murmur of voices hushed as she entered. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, skeptical, curious, some openly dismissive. She felt their weight pressed down on her shoulders. Adler sat at the front row, his arms crossed. He had become the loudest skeptic, insisting this was a farce that would embarrass the department. Dr. Lin sat nearby, his face unreadable but his notes ready. Others leaned forward, pens poised, ready to dissect every word. Coleman guided her to the board. "This is your ground," he whispered. "Stand firm." Then he stepped aside, leaving her alone in the glow of the lamps. Anna picked up a fresh piece of chalk. Her hand shook. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered the oil lamp in the seminar room, burning steady at 2 a.m. She pictured her mother's hands folding laundry late at night. She heard her father's voice, "Say what is right. Do what is good." When she opened her eyes, her fear had not vanished, but it no longer ruled her. She began. Her voice was quiet at first, almost lost in the vast hall. This problem has haunted this university for 20 years. At its heart is not the center, but the edge, the boundary where order frays, where stability gives way to chaos. That is where every attempt has broken. She wrote slowly, her chalk tapping against the board. She explained the failures of the past, the rigid methods that tried to crush the boundary into silence. Then she turned to her own idea. What if the boundary does not need to be crushed? What if it needs to be guided? What if, instead of a wall, we offer it a shore? She drew her lines, step by step, showing how the storm at the edge could be softened, how the system could remain whole. She avoided heavy jargon, but she was precise. Each metaphor carried an explanation beneath it. Each picture in the mind was matched with logic on the board. At first, the professors scribbled furiously, ready to pounce. But as her argument unfolded, the room grew quieter. Even Adler leaned forward despite himself. Questions came, sharp, unyielding. What ensures the stability under perturbation? How do you prove the balance holds beyond the trivial case? What prevents collapse when the system is stretched? Anna listened, her heart pounding, then answered as best she could. Sometimes she faltered, but she steadied herself. She spoke of waves that calmed themselves when allowed to slope, of strings that resonated in harmony when their edges were cushioned, of voices in a choir that blended instead of breaking. Behind each image she anchored the reasoning, careful and deliberate. The questions slowed, pencils stopped scratching. The air thickened with thought. At last, she reached the end. She set the chalk down, her hand aching, her arm weak. She turned toward the council, her breath shallow. That is the path. Not a wall, a shore, not crushed silence, but guided harmony. The hall was silent. Coleman rose from his seat, his eyes shining. Colleagues, you have seen it with your own eyes. For 20 years we stood at the edge of silence. Tonight, it has spoken. Dr. Lin closed his notebook slowly. The reasoning holds, he said at last. The approach is unorthodox, but it holds. Dr. Rhodes nodded quietly beside him. I cannot deny it. Adler alone remained stiff, his jaw tight. He looked at Anna, then at the board. At last he muttered, Even if it holds, it should not have come from here. Not like this. But his words carried no strength. The silence that followed was not his. Then, slowly, something remarkable happened. One professor at the back rose to his feet, his hands coming together in applause. The sound echoed through the hall like a spark. Another joined, then another. Soon the hall was filled with the sound, gentle at first, then rising, a chorus of hands honoring not a janitor, not a professor, but the truth that had been revealed on the board. Anna stood frozen, tears filling her eyes. She had not expected applause. She had expected rejection. But here, under the vaulted ceiling of Princeton, the sound embraced her like a tide. Harris leaned against the doorway, his arms still crossed, but his lips curved into a proud smile. Coleman bowed his head, his heart lightened after decades of carrying failure. And Anna, the girl who had mopped floors, who had read in secret, who had lived in silence, stood before them all with tears streaming down her cheeks, her heart whispering only two words: "It holds." The applause lingered in the great lecture hall long after Anna lowered the chalk. It was not wild, not thunderous. It was steady, like rain tapping against glass, like waves on a gentle shore. For a girl who had spent her life in silence, it was almost unbearable. Her vision blurred. She pressed her hands together to steady herself. She had expected rejection, laughter, dismissal. She had never expected to hear hands clapping for her. Coleman stepped forward, his voice carrying over the sound. "Enough, colleagues. Let us not mistake this moment. What we honor tonight is not a name, nor a station, but the truth revealed on this board." The applause softened and faded, leaving the hall in a silence far different from the one that had greeted Anna's arrival. This silence was not cold. It was reverent, as though the very walls were listening. From the front row, Dr. Lin rose. He adjusted his glasses and spoke carefully. Each word weighed. "The proof is not only clever, it is sound. It must, of course, undergo rigorous verification. But I will not deny what my own eyes have followed. It holds." Dr. Rhodes nodded, his voice quieter. "I concur. We have all witnessed something rare." Adler remained seated, arms crossed, his expression sour. Yet even he did not speak. His silence was louder than his protests had been. Coleman turned toward Anna. His eyes were soft, almost paternal. "You have carried us across a river we could not ford. But the question now is not what you have done, Anna. The question is what you will do." Anna looked at him, startled. "What I will do?" He nodded. "Princeton is not only a place for the preservation of knowledge. It is a place for its growth. And growth requires gardeners, not just guardians. Anna, I cannot let you remain only a janitor here. The university must open its doors to you." A murmur swept through the hall. Professors exchanged glances. Some looked uneasy, others intrigued. Dr. Lin stepped forward. "I propose she be granted a place among our students. Full scholarship. Access to every lecture, every library, every mentor. This mind must not be hidden in shadows any longer." Anna's heart jolted. A place among the students? At Princeton? She shook her head instinctively. "No, I don't belong. I have no papers, no proper schooling. I cannot sit beside those who were born to be here." Coleman's gaze sharpened. "Born to be here? And what, Anna, do you think Princeton was built for?" "It was built for those who seek truth, that is all. You have sought it with more hunger than any I have ever seen. You belong." Harris, leaning in the doorway, spoke in his gravelly voice. "Girl, doors don't ask who you are before they open. They only ask if you have the courage to walk through." The hall grew quiet again. Anna felt her breath catch. She saw herself as she had been only nights ago, scrubbing floors, carrying a broom, folding laundry with her mother in their rented room. She saw her father's toolbox, the old algebra book tucked at the bottom. She saw herself reading by the dim light of an oil lamp, whispering words she barely understood. And now here, in the most hallowed hall of Princeton, they were asking her to stay. Tears filled her eyes. She shook her head slowly. "I don't know if I can." Coleman's voice softened. "You do not have to know, Anna. You only have to begin. The rest will follow." Dr. Lin stepped closer. "The council will vote. But you must understand, this is not charity. This is recognition. The lamp has burned. We cannot ignore its light." One by one, the professors nodded. Even Adler, though reluctant, did not object. The motion passed. Coleman turned back to her. "Anna, Princeton offers you a place, a scholarship in full, a desk among the students, and a chance to walk forward, not in secret but in the open. Do you accept?" The hall seemed to hold its breath. Anna felt her knees weaken. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. She thought of her mother, working late into the night to keep their home alive. She thought of her brother, dreaming of a future she had never dared imagine. She thought of her father, his voice echoing through years of silence. "Say what is right. Do what is good." She lifted her head. Her voice shook, but it carried. "Yes, I accept." The hall exhaled. Some smiled, some nodded, some remained stone-faced. But the decision was sealed. Coleman stepped forward and, with steady hands, draped a student's robe over her shoulders. The fabric was heavy, rich with tradition. Anna stared at herself in disbelief, her fingers running over the cloth. For the first time, she did not feel like she was borrowing light. She felt as though the lamp was hers to carry. Harris clapped his hands once, firm and proud. "Well then," he said, his voice thick, "looks like Princeton's got itself a new kind of student." The hall filled with a ripple of quiet laughter, not mockery, but relief, the kind that follows a storm. Anna stood before them all, wearing the robe of a student, her face wet with tears, but her heart alight. For years, she had walked in silence, cleaning the spaces where knowledge was kept. Now she was being invited to live among it, to learn in the open, to add her own voice to the chorus of discovery. The oil lamp was no longer just a symbol. It was a beginning. The seasons turned. The storm that had once drenched the Princeton campus was now only a memory, though its echo lived in Anna's heart. Months passed, each one carrying her further from the shadows of silence and deeper into the halls of learning. By day, she wore the robe of a student. She sat in lecture halls, not with mop and bucket, but with notebook and pen. At first she was shy, keeping her head low as she always had. Some students whispered when she entered, surprised to see the former janitor among them. But whispers could not drown the quiet force of her presence. She listened with the hunger of someone who had waited years to be fed. Professors noted her questions, careful, searching, humble yet piercing. Slowly, the whispers faded into respect. At night, she still returned to the library. Not because she had to clean it anymore, but because she loved it. The silence of those halls had once been her only companion. Now, that silence welcomed her like an old friend. And yet, it was not the same. One evening, rain returned to Princeton. The storm was not as fierce as the one months before, but the air carried the same smell of wet stone and maple leaves, the same shimmer of lamps against puddles. As the clock neared 2, Anna found herself drawn back to the seminar room, the place where her life had turned. She pushed the heavy door open. The blackboard stood waiting, scrubbed clean, its surface wide and dark. A single oil lamp glowed in the corner, steady as ever, She smiled faintly, remembering the night when that flame had been her only witness. But tonight, she was not alone. A small group of students had followed her, first out of curiosity, then out of admiration. They had heard her story whispered across campus. The janitor who had solved the unsolvable. The girl who had stood before the council and carried a truth none had dared touch. Some came to learn. Some came simply to sit in the presence of someone who had turned silence into song. They gathered around the table, their eyes wide with wonder. One of them, a boy with untamed hair, asked softly, "Is it true, Anna? Did you really solve it in one night?" Anna laughed gently. "No, it took years. Years of nights when no one was watching, years of mistakes and doubts. That night was only when the silence finally chose to break." Another student, a girl with a notebook clutched to her chest, asked, "Will you show us?" "Not the whole proof, just how you saw what others missed." Anna looked at the board. She picked up a piece of chalk, its weight familiar in her hand. She drew slowly, not with the urgency of before, but with patience. She spoke not as one revealing a secret, but as one passing a lamp from hand to hand. "Everyone looked at the storm," she explained. "They tried to stop it by building walls, but storms do not stop for walls. I only asked a different question. What if the storm could be guided? What if the edge was not an enemy, but a place to listen?" Her words were simple, her images clear. The students leaned forward, listening as if to a story rather than a lecture. For them, mathematics that night was not a burden of symbols, but a living voice, tender and human. When she finished, the room was quiet. Not the silence of doubt, nor the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of reverence, the silence of seeds just before they break soil. Anna set the chalk down. She turned to the students and smiled. "This room once held me in loneliness. Tonight it holds us together. That is the difference between silence and song." The oil lamp flickered, its flame reflected in the bright eyes around her. Harris, now retired from his night watch but still faithful to his rounds, appeared in the doorway. He leaned on his cane, his face lit by the glow. "So," he said gruffly, though his eyes softened, "looks like you've turned a lonely night into a gathering." Anna crossed the room and took his hand. "You guarded the door when I could not. Now the door is open." Coleman, too, came quietly into the room. He had watched from afar, giving space for Anna to find her own voice. Seeing her surrounded by eager faces, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "The lamp was never meant to stay in one pair of hands," he said. "It was meant to be passed on." The rain outside eased into mist. The campus slept, but in that one room, life glowed. Anna sat among the students, her robe gathered around her like a cloak. She listened to their questions, their laughter, their nervous confessions of doubt. She told them what she wished someone had told her years ago. That knowledge was not reserved for the chosen, that silence could be broken, that even the smallest flame could guide through the darkest night. The clock struck 2, the same hour when once she had stood trembling, alone under the lamp's glow. Tonight, she was not alone. The flame burned steadily. Faces leaned toward it, toward her, toward the board. The night that had once belonged only to shadows now belonged to them all. And in that moment, Anna knew. The silence that had shaped her life was gone. In its place was a chorus. In its place was light. The night was no longer alone. Thank you for walking with me through this story. Perhaps somewhere within each of us, there is also a small oil lamp waiting to be lit. If Anna's journey brought you a little warmth, I invite you to stay, to listen with me to more stories of healing and hope. You may choose to subscribe so that whenever a new lamp is lit, you will be among the first to see its light. May your night be peaceful.